Okay, I see lots of folks signing in, and we're about a minute early. But I think in the interest of time, I might just jump into the housekeeping stuff because it'll take a minute to get through. So that way we can make sure our presenters have as much time as they need to get through everything. I'll just go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us today, everybody. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuary series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Today's webinar features a science transfer project that ended 2024, I believe. They used accessible image classification methods, including common machine learning classifiers and freely available non-proprietary data to create a habitat map of the St. Louis River Estuary. And there's a lot of really cool technical stuff that the team will talk more about that I will not talk about. But before we get to that, as always, we've got a quick introduction to the reserve system and the Science Collaborative program for those who are maybe less familiar or who just need a refresher. Okay, so the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve site includes programs focused on the activities that you can see on the slide here, which include land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training engagement programs for the public and local officials, and education. Science Collaborative's program's mission is to support collaborative research that addresses coastal management issues that are important to the reserve system and that strengthen the system's ability to impact coastal management and decision making. And one important way we meet this goal is by sharing these collaborative science accomplishments publicly through a variety of channels that include this webinar series, Collaborative Science for Estuaries, which features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative program staff and partners. So, quick note on informed consent. So, because webinars are both a way for us to share project impacts more broadly and also just a really valuable learning opportunity for us as a program, insights from speakers and participants like you can help inform how we support others in doing their own collaborative science work, for example, in the development of future workshops and webinars, or resources such as tools, tips, and case studies for our open access guide to collaborative science, which can be found on our website. So, with that in mind, we just want to inform attendees that any insights or feedback you share, for example, in the chat or via the webinar exit survey, which will open up after you leave the session, may be used for program learning and development purposes. Please note that if we capture a direct quote from you that we'd like to use for learning purposes, we will reach out to you first to seek permission and provide an explanation of its use. And any direct quotes would only be used anonymously. Quick note on housekeeping stuff. All attendees are muted upon entry, as you probably noticed. We'll be handling questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can either enter questions for the presenters as they occur to you throughout the webinar, which we actually encourage so you don't forget your question. And we'll plan to ask as many as we can once we get to the end of the session. You can also put them in the chat. We'll be watching both, so wherever feels right, just go ahead and jot them down. Chat's visible to all. I think I mentioned that as some folks were joining, but in case you missed it, chat's open to everybody, so you can use it to ask us questions or talk amongst yourselves. And I will be watching it for any technical questions that you might have. You can chat organizers directly. That's myself or Ariana Stokes, who's on backup. And with that, I'd love to introduce our speakers for today's session. So joining me today are Howard Berrigan, the state cartographer for the Wisconsin State Cartographer's Office, who served as the PI for this project, and Kirsten Rude, the stewardship coordinator at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve, who served as the collaborative lead. And I'll pass it over to you folks.
Great. Well, thanks, Nick and Howard. As Nick mentioned, I'm Kirsten Rude. I'm the stewardship coordinator at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve, here with Howard Berrigan, the state cartographer for Wisconsin, also part of University of Wisconsin-Madison, talking today about the St. Louis River Estuary habitat map and the interdisciplinary approach that we took to develop it. Normally for presentations like this, I feel like I usually start with an awesome picture of the reserve or a landscape or something like that. But this was such a big and interdisciplinary team, and we could not have done it without everyone. And so it feels important to start out with the acknowledgement slide that you will also see at the end. But this was really a large team effort. That Howard and I worked with, including folks at University of Minnesota geospatial, remote sensing experts, Carl Sack at Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College, who really helped with kind of the inception of this project and the methods that we took, as well as getting to work with some students from that college to help with the mapping and field work. some local ecologists from Suba Ecological Consulting and Shoreview Ecology, and folks at Natural Resources Research Institute to fly some drone imagery, including many students throughout this project, both from UW-Superior, University of Minnesota Duluth, and the State Cartographer's Office at UW-Madison, and Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. So this was really a big team effort. It's always good to kind of orient to where we are on these national webinars. So the St. Louis River Estuary, we are in the Great Lakes on the far western side of Lake Superior. The St. Louis River Estuary runs along the boundary between Wisconsin and Minnesota in the Duluth-Superior metro area, and is the largest tributary entering into Lake Superior on the US side of the border. St. Louis River Estuary is a really important resource ecologically, culturally, and economically. Um, and there's also been a really robust cleanup effort here. In 1987, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement designated the 12,000 acre freshwater estuary here one of the Great Lakes areas of concern due to legacy contamination and disturbances from industrial use that left many kind of impairments and habitat loss. And so there's been a decades-long effort to cleaning up and restoring the estuary here in the Twin Ports. So zooming in a little bit more on the next slide to the reserve boundaries. The kind of catalyst for this project was making a habitat map for the Lake Superior Reserve, which encompasses just over 16,700 acres in and around Superior, Wisconsin. And our boundaries are here on the map. We are one of the reserves. We don't own any of the land. All of this is publicly owned. And so we have 5 key landholding partners. But these are our boundaries. And thinking about making a habitat map, I thought it might be fun to start with a poll question of what do you all know about your reserve's habitat map? So a poll should have just popped up for you to choose how much you know about your map, from you as one of the people who are maybe making it to what is a reserve habitat map? I thought you were going to tell me that's why I'm here at this webinar.
Got a few more stragglers. All right. Maybe we'll call it there. So here is a snapshot of what we see in the audience today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So we have a broad mix, and over half that are excited for this next slide where we talk about what a habitat map is. All right. So the reserve habitat maps, the catalyst for this project was to develop a reserve habitat map, which is one of the system-wide or NERRS-wide elements that each reserve has. So this is a no requirement that every National Estuarine Research Reserve develop a habitat map using the same classification system or classification scheme. There are a handful of other kind of system-wide elements throughout the reserve program, including like the monitoring program where all the reserves are taking the same data in the same way across the whole system. And so this is one of those system-wide elements. Some of the goals are to be able to see these habitats at a site. Because it's nationwide, we can also see things at a regional or system-wide scales, both to show like kind of a snapshot of what these habitats and places are now. And there's also a goal to repeat these regularly, something at like 10-year intervals, so that you can also see trends over time and see those spatial changes over time that can help see some of the impacts of land use and adjacent watersheds, of climate change, changes in local water level and inundation patterns. So to be able to see what's happening and changing in reserves around the country. This program is the class. This started about a decade ago, and so maybe a little bit more. So reserves are kind of just so the reserves that made habitats map or made their habitat maps kind of earlier, just at the point where they're starting to make or think about their updates to those maps. So the Lake Superior Reserve, we were working on our first habitat map. Um, the NERRS classification scheme is the scheme that all reserves use. It is based on the National Wetlands Inventory, which I believe is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service inventory, but includes a few more habitat types as well. Um, this is a really exciting and important project, but also comes with some challenges, including the methodology isn't set in stone or dictated. There are SOPs or standard operating procedures, but those kind of dictate what the end result or map should look like and not the methodology that you need to use to get there, which provides a lot of flexibility, but also it leaves you with kind of a blank slate to start from. Also, this is a big endeavor, and there aren't a ton of resources to help reserves get to that final habitat map. NOAA OCM has an awesome geospatial team, but they don't have the capacity to make these maps for us. And while some reserves have geospatial staff and technical experts on their team, at the Lake Superior Reserve, we don't have a dedicated geospatial or GIS person. Some of the methods you might use, like remote sensing, is different than GIS, and so the technical expertise is also can be a challenge. So we partnered with Howard at the State Cartographer's Office, which is also part of UW-Madison, our state partner, to help tackle this problem and figure out how we were going to create our habitat map here. So through a few internal grants through UW-Madison, we were able to start working together on developing a methodology or workflow to figure out how we were going to address this challenge and create a habitat map. So we got two grants through University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension to develop and figure out what that methodology was going to be. As part of that, we assembled a technical team of experts that included geospatial experts from around the state and Great Lakes, including some from NOAA, like Brandon Crumweedy, our geospatial expert at OCM in the Great Lakes, as well as local ecological experts here in the Twin Ports, recognizing that we wanted this map to be something that was useful beyond just checking the box for NOAA that we have a habitat map, but something that local partners would find useful. And we talked with them about kind of existing data sources, classification methods and sampling methodology, accuracy assessment procedures, and kind of some of the things that rose to the top were that some of the primary objectives were going to be to develop tools and methods using open source geospatial technology and resources so that these would hopefully be things that we could repeat again in the future. And and have a methodology that we could repeat to hopefully make this easier in 10 years or so when we think about doing this again. And also thinking about how our partners could use this and if there was other data that we might be able to collect or things we could think about while we were creating this map so that it would really meet local needs here in the St. Louis River Estuary. So with that in mind, while we were working on this, at the same time, the St. Louis River Habitat Work Group, which is a collaborative group with over 40 organizations working in the St. Louis River Estuary on restoration, conservation, habitat work. Those organizations come from all levels of government, from local, state, federal, tribal, as well as universities and nonprofits. So it's a really robust collaborative team. Had been working on updating a habitat plan from 2002. So this habitat plan was part of the area of concern process and was kind of a vision for um, restoration and conservation needs in the estuary that was last done in 2002 and it is currently being updated. You can see on the right hand of this slide that there were some maps from that 2002 plan that were classifying the habitat types and aquatic communities in the estuary at that time, but there wasn't a plan for updating those maps yet for this new iteration of the habitat plan. So we, kind of wondered, is there a way to feed two birds with one scone and both meet the needs of this, making a habitat map for the reserve system for NOAA, while also meeting the needs of the habitat work group for this habitat plan update, so that they could better understand current conditions, support identification and prioritization for future restoration and conservation projects, and maybe look back also and see what changes there have been in the last 20 or so years. Thanks to the Science Collaborative, we were able to get some funding to transfer the methods and kind of methodology and plan we had for the NERRS habitat map to a broader geography. Rather than just looking at 16,700 acres, look at 57,000 acres of wetlands and adjacent uplands for the lower 21 miles of the St. Louis River Estuary, where the kind of furthest downstream dam on the St. Louis River is. This study area was identified based on habitat work group needs, including all of the reserve boundaries, as well as a few key other areas or sites, including Magny-Snively State Natural Area on the west side of this, and then the Imagery River. And the goal was to create some like repeatable methodology using kind of high resolution imagery, remote sensing methods to create a repeatable map, repeatable habitat map that could be used by the habitat work group, as well as our NOAA habitat map. So we assembled a multi-interdisciplinary team to make that happen, including geospatial experts, remote sensing and cartography experts, as well as some local ecologists and members of the habitat work group to work together to make this happen. One of the first things that our collaborators at University of Minnesota Geospatial did after talking with this whole team is pulled together a mosaic of the study site. For that, we used high resolution imagery that was NAIP, National Agriculture Imagery Program imagery, which is flown by the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, I believe every other year for each state. Because we're spanning two states, we had imagery from 2021 and 2022. 2021 was the Minnesota imagery, and then 2022 was Wisconsin. And this is at a 0.6 meter resolution. So each kind of pixel or image is 60 centimeters. When there were overlapping areas, we prioritized Wisconsin imagery because it was 1 year more recent. So this was the imagery that we were using. This is also free. It's flown every year, or flown every other year. So this is also a long data set for this imagery and program. And this is what we used to kind of classify, or the imagery that we used to get to our final map. As part of this project, over 2 summers, we had 3 students traveling across the estuary. In the first year, they focused on the reserve boundaries, and then after we got the Science Collaborative funding, they were able to do the whole estuary in year 2, mapping these habitats on the ground. So the plan was to use this data, on the ground data, as training data to teach the machine learning model to identify different habitat types. So these students went to each of these places and ID'd each habitat to the subclass or the most specific NERRS classification system level. And over the 2 years, they mapped over 1,000 acres using the uh, ARC Field Maps app. So they went all over the estuary, had a pretty fun and adventurous summer. While they were out there, we also had them collect a few other data points, in part talking with the Habitat work group of what was other information that we might find useful since we have students traveling all over the estuary for the summer. And so other data that they collected included dominant species, presence, absence of a number of non-local beings or invasive species of concern. So we identified, I think it was 7 different species and had them look for those. Presence, absence of monomen or wild rice, which is another important species here in the estuary. So in sites where monomen was kind of possible. So in some of those wetland areas, we had them look for presence, absence, or dominance of monomen. And then presence, absence of hemimarsh, which is a habitat of particular concern here, which is a patchwork or mosaic of open water and emergent wetland. Over these summers, we learned a lot about the habitats of the reserve and estuary, but ultimately had some challenges in actually using these polygons to train the machine learning model, which Howard will talk about a little bit more. So while we did use these, we didn't use them quite in the way that we expected to when we sent the students out collecting this data. Zooming out to what the NERRS classification system is, at the broadest level, these are the different systems that are in the classification system. We were able to ignore a few. So on the next slide, there were a few that we don't have here in the St. Louis River Estuary. As a freshwater estuary, we don't have saltwater, and so marine and estuarine, because estuarine was defined by salt, could be crossed off. And while it is cold up here, we don't have ice cover year round. And so we were also able to cross out perennial snow and ice. This is a national classification system. So these were the ultimate habitat kind of systems that we were looking at. If you look at the image here and think about how a computer or machine learning algorithm might be able to tell what is river or lake. And you'll notice you maybe can't do that so well from an aerial imagery. I can see the water, but I don't know that I could train or tell a computer which of these is river or lake just by looking at the aerial imagery. Or wetland for that matter. And same with I see that there are trees, but I couldn't tell you if those are trees in palustrine or wetland habitat or in an upland just by looking at this imagery. And so that was one of the early challenges that we found while thinking about kind of the classification system and using remote sensing methodology to tackle this problem. So on the next slide, we ended up switching to thinking about what we can see from aerial imagery, and instead classify those kind of figured out instead habitat structure types, so what you could see from aerial imagery. It's a little easier maybe to think about which of these is forested or herbaceous and kind of grassy cover, which of these is water. And so we ended up shifting and looking at these habitat structure types when we were thinking about the remote sensing and coming up with a second phase, as Howard is going to talk about, to narrow those down more. So I'm going to pass it off to Howard.
Thanks, Kirsten. Well, I think one of the themes that runs through what Kirsten has been talking about is the word challenge. This was a very challenging project. I think that's what made it so much fun. It was a long project. It took us 3 years to do it, and a whole bunch of different people with a lot of different areas of expertise. As Kirsten noted, we went into this wanting to create an approach that was both open. In other words, we're using open source methods and open source tools that we could share with others, using open source data that we didn't have to purchase, but also to create an approach that was repeatable. And that would be for the NERRS itself in 10 years' time, or for the Habitat Work Group, or potentially for other groups of people who are interested in doing something similar for a different area. So those were kind of that was the basis of our approach. But back to this question of challenges. So in the end, what we ended up having to do was run kind of a two-phase approach to the project. So in the first phase, and what Kirsten covered in the first set of slides, is to derive that high resolution, essentially land cover map of the estuary using the NAIP imagery. So to do that, we used training polygons that were produced by visual interpretation of the NAIP imagery. Actually like digitize those on screen. And those created those structure types that Kirsten mentioned. So herbaceous, water, scrub, shrub, rocky, and things like that. In the second phase, we really applied a post-processing step to the initial land cover classes that came out of our machine learning classifier. So the objective of phase 2 was really to refine those UNet derived, or UNet was one of the classifiers that we used to refine those structure types in order to get closer to the NERRS classes that we really needed for our final data set. Okay, so just kind of stepping back a minute or two, the phase 1 part of the project, just to kind of give a little bit more detail on what was done. We tried 2 different machine learning approaches. And when I say we, this was primarily the work of the folks at Geospatial, whom we worked with on this project, our partners, who were more remote sensing experts than any of the other folks on the team. So the 2 approaches they used were called random forest, which you may have heard of. It's quite widely used in remote sensing. And the other one, which I've referred to already a little bit, is UNet. And that's not used so much for remote sensing. It's used more in computer vision, also in the medical sciences for doing interpretation of imagery. In both cases, we used a supervised classification strategy. So we chose samples, in other words, the training data or the training polygons that we identified on screen, fed those to the algorithm, and then trained the algorithm on the sort of spectral signature, if you will, of the training data, and then unleashing that on the image as a whole. So rather than letting the computer, the algorithm, decide what classes were there, we did the training up front and tried to match the structure types after the fact. As Kirsten mentioned, for band NAIP imagery, we used various combinations of bands and various indices, just kind of mathematically relating them to each other. We also used some image texture descriptors. So those are when you look at local variations around a pixel in terms of the spectral responses in those different bands, to sort of try to identify the amount of variability over space, which is helpful for comparing things like forest to scrub shrub, which have much different spatial patterns. The only way you can really get at that is to use a texture kind of description. We also use DEMs, digital elevation models, in part for this approach. And then, as I said, trained the classifier on the multidimensional signature, so all those band combinations, the indices, the texture, the DEMs, and then applied that to the image as a whole. Comparing the 2 methods, random forest, by the way, random forest is a pixel by pixel classifier, so it classifies each pixel on the image, each of those 0.6 by 0.6 meter pixels from the NAIP imagery. So the only really neighborhood functions that you can work into that, in other words, the only way you can look at a neighborhood and look at the variability within that is through texture measures or texture indices. Whereas UNet is sort of intrinsically based on a neighborhood. In fact, it uses patches of pixels, kind of rectangular patches, and uses those in a neighborhood approach as part of its learning, process. We also ran the UNet in what we called ensemble mode. In other words, we took the imagery and sort of rotated it in different ways to get as much information as we could out of the associations in that imagery. So shadows that would be facing north, we flipped the image over so that they would face south, so that the classifier could identify trees, for example, very well. In terms of evaluating whether random forest or UNet was better, it was a bit of a qualitative as well as a quantitative assessment. The random forest method had a lot more sort of, if you will, salt and pepper, a lot more high frequency spatial variation. You can see that in the two images in the center, whereas UNet appeared to be a whole lot smoother, maybe overgeneralized some classes a little bit more. There are obvious differences in these two images between the ability of these two machine classifiers to identify things. For example, in the top image in the center, Random Forest has identified the river as herbaceous. I think that is in yellow vegetation, so that did not work out too well. So a lot of qualitative as well as qualitative assessments done to try to figure out which of these methods was better. These are just some examples of the training sites we used. I think these are unconsolidated shore. The second one is a cultural feature, I think. Herbaceous, a small herbaceous area, other rocky areas, and so on. So again, to clarify this, the training areas for the UNet classifier, which we ultimately chose, were extracted on screen from the imagery. So that's not to be confused with the 1,600 plus training sites that Kirsten talked about when you saw the photograph of two of our students. Those were used later on in phase 2. All right, so this image shows you the initial UNet classification results on the right. So on the left-hand side is kind of a zoomed out view of the NAIP mosaic. And on the right is the structure types that we derived from UNet. And again, we've kind of already mentioned this, but just to emphasize this fact, initially we had hoped that our training data that we collected in the field, those 1,600 plus polygons, could be fed right into the algorithm and it would identify the NERRS classes that we wanted to find. Unfortunately, that did not work out. I think Kirsten mentioned a couple of cases like the inability to differentiate forest that's upland versus forest that's wetland. Those were just not discernible on the imagery that we were using. So this is where phase 2 comes in. So here's a close-up of the structure types for one small portion of the study area that shows you some of the challenges that we faced working with this type of imagery. And again, remember that we're dealing with, unlike satellite imagery, let's say, we're dealing with aerial photography that is patched together to create a mosaic. And each of these photographs is taken from a different angle. And therefore, the relationship of the camera to the sun changes all across the image. Not to mention the fact that we also had imagery of 2 different dates, some from 2021, some from 2022. So that sort of diagonal seam you can see across the NAIP imagery on the left is not a real feature geographically. It's just due to the fact that the reflectance of that water has changed for the focal point of the 2 photographs that are joined at that point. And any type of classifier that's primarily based on spectral response or spectral reflectance in a particular band of the electromagnetic spectrum is going to get confused in these situations. And UNet was certainly no exception to this. And you can see that it was trying to classify, or it classified some of those areas of water as that orange human-made structures or cultural on the right-hand side. So yet another example of some of the challenges we faced using this approach. So this is where phase 2 comes in. So again, what we're trying to do in the phase 2 part is to extract the NERRS classes from the structure types that came out of UNet. This is a very early draft flowchart, if you will, of the GIS rules, Geographic Information System rules, that we ultimately adopted. I don't know how many revisions we made of this. This is version 1.0. But I think we probably got to 4 or 5. It was a complicated process that involved, simultaneously understanding what we could see on the imagery and on the UNet classification, as well as what our ecological consultants were suggesting, we should be able to extract. So a lot of dialogue and discussion went into the ultimate rules that we adopted. Okay, so again, phase two, we're post-processing the UNet structure types using GIS-based rules and ancillary data sets. And again, the idea is to improve the UNet classification to get closer to the NERRS classes that we want. So ultimately, in phase two, we developed a set of 8 different geospatial rules. I'm not going to go into these in a huge amount of detail because it gets a little bit involved. But I should mention, and you will be able to see this if you check out our project page, that all of the data, all of the rules, all of the code that we used, both for the unit classifier and the phase two part, are on 2 separate GitHub repositories. So longer and more in-depth discussions are available for anybody who wants to dive in a little bit deeper. But as an example of these rules, and by the way, for each rule set, we took the results from the previous rule set and fed it into the next rule set in kind of on a rolling basis. So for rule set 1, our input was the UNet classified map. The output of rule set 1 went into rule set 2. The output of rule set 2 went into rule set 3, and so on. And essentially, if you look at these, you can see that what we're doing here is applying rules and ancillary data sets to try to improve some of those problems that we identified on the UNet map. So that problem, and probably the biggest one of all, the wetland versus upland classification, which was essentially impossible on using the aerial photography. We employed a data set called Landfire, which you're probably quite familiar with, coded their riparian classes and created an overlay, which allowed us to then switch classes on the UNet map. So if it was within a wetland category as defined by Landfire, but the map said it was, and the map said it was forest, then it was classified as forested wetland, et cetera. So that's kind of the flavor of what we were doing here. And through a variety of different ancillary data sets, we refined the wetland categories. We were able to differentiate lake from river, which again, seems obvious to the human eye that you should be able to do that, but from a machine perspective is actually very difficult. We applied bathymetry data in order to derive the littoral versus limnetic subdivision, which was required for that class. And then kind of getting towards the end of the process, there were some spot fixes that we applied based on input primarily from our ecological consultants to correct areas that I think I identified or showed you, some examples of this earlier on, areas that were water but were identified as cultural, things like that. So a lot of refinement of those initial classification results. In the process of doing this, we also slightly modified the NERRS classification system. And this slide shows you in that kind of orange color, yellow-orange color, the classes that on our map, our final map, that are slightly different from what you would find in the kind of the standard manual for this classification system. So we created a new class called pond. So these are palustrian perennial water bodies. They're very small. They're not large enough to be considered lakes or rivers, but they're permanently covered by water. They could be natural, or they could be created and modified by people. Under herbaceous, number 9, aquatic marsh was a huge one. This took us many, many discussions to kind of unravel. This is a hybrid class. And again, aquatic marsh is not something that appears in the original NERRS classification system. But these are aquatic habitats in rivers that are dominated by plants that grow under or on the water surface or seasonally grow out of the water surface. And there we have, parameters in terms of percentage cover of submerged aquatic or floating leaf and so on. So it's a very specific type of class. Essentially equivalent, and Kirsten can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm more into the GIS and remote sensing stuff than the ecology, but something that's often referred to as hemi-marsh. Kirsten is not saying no, so I believe I got that correct. A few other things that we did differently. Rocky, it was very difficult. Unlike unconsolidated river shore, lake shore, upland, rocky, we did not decide to differentiate by whether it was upland versus riverine, just because we felt that ecologically it probably wasn't that important, and it's kind of difficult to do that. We did do that for unconsolidated river, lake, and upland. That was one of the steps, one of the rule sets that we applied in the phase 2 part of the process, but we did not do that to rocky. Another huge area of discussion and debate and so on was the cultural class. And, our map coming out of UNET actually very successfully identified what you might call, impervious or very obviously human-made structures of the landscape. So whether that is parking lots or roads or buildings, houses, factories, etc., those are clearly identified. But the NERRS classification system essentially, wanted us to, this is oversimplifying it a little bit, but wanted us to consolidate not only those types of features, but also the associated vegetation or unconsolidated or rocky features that are sort of interspersed within urban and developed areas. And we chose instead to let those areas speak for themselves and classified them according to the other classes in the classification system. So in our case, cultural really refers to the human environment and the human environment only. But we feel that was the right decision to make. We felt, and we feel. This is the final St. Louis River Estuary habitat map. The QR codes will take you to an ArcGIS Online or AGOL map that'll let you investigate this a little bit, kind of pan around and zoom in and out, things like that. So we did a couple of additional things, one of which obviously was to calculate the accuracy of our results. We conducted an accuracy assessment a couple of different ways. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but this classification error matrix shows you the results that we obtained comparing our training data to the final habitat map that I just showed you on the last screen. So we're getting accuracies around 73 or 74%, which we thought was pretty good, given the complexity of the task we were looking at. Some of the areas that we're still having some problems with are the wetland, upland categories, especially for forested, unconsolidated upland, but actually herbaceous upland, which is a little bit odd. Scrub shrub versus forest, rocky and cultural. That kind of makes sense because those spectral signatures often look kind of the same. So a few things that could be tweaked and improved, but overall we were not too unhappy, I guess I would say, with our classification error results. I think that this is fairly typical of this type of work. Especially when you're getting down to very detailed classes like the ones, or fairly detailed classes like the ones we were looking at a higher level of generalization. If we're just talking about forest or scrub shrub and so on, accuracy is generally going to be higher, but the deeper you dive in, the lower your accuracy scores are generally going to be. The other thing we did is a change analysis to the 2022 map, and this, I think, is going to this discussion is going to bleed in a little bit to some comments that Kirsten's going to make about what we're doing with the data set now. But our initial attempt to compare the 2022 map to our 2025 habitat map showed a lot of agreement. There were a few areas that were where change had occurred, where we sort of expected it to. We found it a little bit difficult to do a crosswalk between the categories in our map and those that were used in the habitat map. They were a little bit different, and we weren't really sure. And another thing you can see here very clearly, and this is something I alluded to a few slides ago, the 2022 map on top, this is showing you that sort of maroon, I guess that is, dark red area. That's the urban or developed or human made area as identified on that map. And as I mentioned on our map, within that urban blob, there's a whole lot more detail showing. So part of the reason that the two maps don't agree more is because the classification is really quite different. The level of spatial resolution that we adopted is really quite different than was used in 2022. So it's hard to compare sometimes using different methodologies. Okay, I think I might be at the end of my little section. Yes.
Thanks, Howard.
So take it away, Kirsten.
All right, I've got the last couple of slides to take us home before you guys ask your questions. Um, so just wanted to highlight that all of the final products that are part of this work can be found on the Neuroscience Collaborative project page here. That includes links to the final habitat map, both like viewable and you can also download the geodatabase and have those files for if you want to dig deeper and have that for your ARC Pro account as well. We also have the methodologies for both phases of this project so that others can view it and hopefully it can be, repeated and easier to do in the future or for others to think about as adapting to their site. There's also the accuracy assessment and change analysis, which, as Howard mentioned, the change analysis proved particularly challenging from 2002 due to a little bit different classification system and methodologies of just resolution. But those do exist for folks to look at. And then there's also a few intermediate products like drone imagery from a few bays of this site that was even higher resolution, which is some really cool data to take a look at. The NAIP mosaic is available for download, as well as the training data polygons, recognizing that that boots on the ground effort would be useful for local natural resource managers to be able to look at as well, and kind of see some of the dominant species in those areas. And there's also a photo for each of those polygons and that kind of thing. So you can dive deeper at the project webpage on the Science Collaborative. On the next slide, you'll also see a poster version of the habitat map that we developed with our graphic designer, which is something for natural resource professionals in the area to display and use. With the front has the habitat map on one side, and then on the back side is just photos and descriptions of what those kind of final habitats of the habitats are, the little blurb of what it means. And as for what's next with the habitat map, the habitat work group is actively working on a habitat plan update and hopes to have that finalized by the end of the calendar year. Members are using the map as they work on that plan. And we also have a master's student from UW-Madison's Environmental Conservation Program, Rachel Gray, up for the summer, who is thinking more critically and carefully about how to connect the habitat map and habitat plan, such as whether there are additional analyses that we can do with the existing map that can help inform the plan, whether there are habitat plan metrics that can be tied to the map or kind of helping identify targets as we get to the next stage of the habitat plan and identifying certain targets for those metrics. So we're excited to have Rachel here this summer thinking, helping both the habitat work group and think a little bit more and make those connections and have some dedicated time to work on that. So with that in mind, as we close, I'm going to also, you can ask us, please ask us all the questions you have. And I'm also going to pose a question to you all, which is, how is your reserve using your habitat map? Or how would you like to see your habitat map being used? Please feel free to put a little blurb in the chat. Or if you don't have time, but you have ideas, you are welcome to reach out to me by email. And I think some of the stewardship and GIS folks will be getting an email from me later today or tomorrow with this question as well, to help out on Rachel as she's thinking about this project. So thanks, everybody. And we'll answer what questions you have.
Thanks so much to Kirsten and Howard. We do have a couple questions that have already popped up. So, folks, if you want to also answer the question that Kirsten posed, which I posted in the chat, while you're looking at that, we can start answering some of the questions that we have here. Don't be shy. We've still got a few minutes, so feel free to keep them coming if you have them. And if we don't get to all of them today, we'll pass them on to the presenters to type up or some quick responses that I'll include in the product summary stuff. So, first questions we have here, did changing the habitat structure labels from the national system have any ramifications for the project? A knowing smile from both of them.
Kristen, do you want to do that one or me?
I can I can start. So I don't know when this question was asked, but hopefully as you saw, we kind of got back to the NERRS classification system in phase two. So we did like move our way back to the NERRS classification system. As Howard mentioned, we did have a few modifications to that in our final map, which we did based on kind of the data that we had and in consultation with the habitat work group and what was useful and meaningful habitats here and what would be more useful for the habitat work group, thinking about the habitat plan and our local needs here. There is we will be working soon on getting our NERRS habitat map approved by NOAA. I think that there hasn't been a habitat, there's been kind of a lull. And so there is the committee needs to kind of reconvene to think about the next steps for how to approve the habitat maps, which hasn't needed to happen for a little while. And I think there's been a recognition that there are some ways that that might need to change. And so the short answer is, as far as like approval and that kind of thing, we have not we have not done that yet. So we'll see, but hopefully it will work from NOAA's perspective. And I know when we're talking, to NOAA too, and we're like, we're doing what works for us here and for what we need here, and then we'll cross the bridges of NOAA approval, which again we're very close, and hopefully that will work for our final approval as well. We'll see.
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Howard, before I move on?
Oh, I think Kristen did a great job answering that.
Perfect. Okay, so next question. Did you apply bathymetry or specific lake elevation to define the rules for aquatic marsh versus emergent wetland, especially given the fluctuations of lake levels over time?
So no bathymetry or lake elevation for aquatic marsh. These were riverine ecosystems, not lake. So lake level fluctuations weren't an issue, although seiche is an issue. So there was no specific bathymetry applied to differentiate those two.
Yeah, we ended up using just the imagery and then we did use some other ancillary data sets, but the bathymetry and the estuary wasn't one of them. We did
Yeah.
have lots of conversations about lake levels and impacts of seiche and that kind of thing. And I think at some points talked about like confidence intervals and that kind of thing. But ultimately, I think decided that this was like a snapshot in time for these for the map as we see it.
Yes, which was a big debate item kind of fairly early on, right? Should it be a
Yeah,
snapshot in time, or should we somehow try to accommodate variations in the level of the lake and the level of the river? So,
yeah, we
which
had many meetings talking about changing lake levels,
I
but
think
at
that
this point,
I think the aquatic marsh, I think that in terms of height and so on, that was more related to height of, in certain cases, height of the vegetation above the water itself. So we even talked about using LiDAR imagery, digital elevation models over time, taken to see if we could identify classes based on that. So more so than bathymetry itself. But obviously that would be impacted by height of water in the river. So
Okay, got a couple more questions here. How was national wetlands inventory data considered in the project?
yep.
Yes. I think it's more about how. Maybe
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Well, we did not use National Wetlands Inventory for that initial mask of wetlands and uplands. We used the sea fire data instead, and that was in part based on an analysis of the available national. I don't remember now. It's been a couple of years actually, but whether we looked at National Wetlands Inventory or the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory on our side of the river, but it was difficult using that imagery to really, or using that data set to really differentiate between wetlands and uplands because so many of the classes, in fact, it ended up being cross-referenced as being wetlands. So most of the estuary would have been classified as wetland. So we looked around for a variety of different data sets and applying the sea fire or the land fire data resulted in a map that, while not perfect, our ecological consultants looked or felt kind of better, felt right with a better balance between uplands and wetlands. At least that is my recollection, but I don't know if Kirsten, if you have any other thoughts on that or your memory is different than mine.
No, I think you're better equipped to answer that question.
Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. So this last question that we have here, I'm maybe going to just like rephrase a little bit because I think it's a good one to end on. But the original question was, knowing what you know now, what would you have gone about differently for the project? So to keep it simple, pick one thing that you wish you could do differently. The next for if you do the project again, what's one thing you do differently?
I'll let Kirsten go first. I have some thoughts, but
If you have thoughts, I think you should go.
okay. I think that we went into this and we had a lot of consultation with NOAA and you know followed their suggestions about using NAIP imagery. I think this imagery is great imagery. I think it's very, very challenging to use for the type of classification that we're using. So, if you want to continue to maintain that sort of no cost or low cost public access data, maybe there aren't a lot of better alternatives, but there certainly are a lot of other sensors out there that would have allowed us to get down to the classifications that we wanted to much earlier on. You know, multi-band aerial imagery just doesn't quite cut it for what we're trying to do. And you can get there, but it's a long kind of convoluted process. So I think if I were going to do it again, investigating what some other types of sensors uh, that we could obtain imagery from would be a starting point.
I think what jumps to mind for me is spending a little bit more time we had a really interdisciplinary team, which I think was really useful and powerful for this project. Um, but we'd also meant that we talked around or past each other a little bit especially at the beginning of the project, when we were maybe talking about the same thing, but doing it in different ways or using language or jargon that, we all didn't quite understand. So I would maybe spend a little bit more time at the beginning, um, just getting to know each other's subject area expertise and kind of how we were approaching and thinking about this problem. I'd maybe spend a little more time early on, talking through that together, which might have made things go faster later. I don't want to say save like headaches because I think we all learned a lot and had a really valuable experience, but I think we could have um, would have gotten some places faster if we had spent a little more time understanding how we all thought about this problem in different ways, early on.
Spoken like a practiced collaborative lead. Well done. All right, folks, that's it. We are out of time. If you are looking for the recording, you can check back in a couple days. Usually just takes us a day or two to get them processed. When you leave the webinar session, you should automatically be prompted to take the exit survey. If you can spare a minute to do so, please do. It really helps us kind of learn how to evolve the webinar series and what we can do better. So if you have a minute, just it's 4 questions, so and they're quick. Um, big thank you to Kirsten and Howard for taking the time to be with us here today and for putting together such a great presentation and answering questions. We'll catch you in the next one. So look out for the end of July. If you haven't seen any webinar announcements yet, more will be coming. So big thank you to our presenters.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks
All
to you,
right.
Nick.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.